Okay, unfortunately, I couldn't raise the volume any more than what it was. I'm sorry about that. I guess we'll have to next time we'll try to watch a different video about Commodus. I wanted to show a video on Commodus because he was one of the how can you say it? One of the famous or infamous um, characters of the Roman Empire. He was an absolute maniac. Um, he was very colorful, but very insane. I think literally he was crazy. Um, Consequently, as the video said at the end, he was murdered. He was assassinated by poisoning and by a wrestler coming into the bathroom where he was taking a bath and strangling him. First, they poisoned him, and then and then this guy strangled him. But he was as nasty can get. Um, if you ever wanna, well, there's a romanticized movie about him with Russell Crowe, but the movie is not accurate. Historically speaking, it's not accurate um, because in the movie, Russell Crowe kills Commodus, which is not true. Uh, Even the character that Russell Crowe played was not really a character. Um, so it was a somewhat uh, inaccurate movie historically, but it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to watch. It's called The Gladiators, in case you, or The Gladiator, I think it's called. And Russell Crowe. I mean, let's face it, Russell Crowe is a pretty cool guy. Uh, he's a good actor, and you know, and it's pretty nice. But, however, it's not really an accurate movie. What I can tell you though is that Commodus was uh, was a nut. He was a nut, and because of him, a lot of cruelty happened. A lot of people were killed. Uh, a lot of animals. He used to kill animals on the arena, and so he was not a nice guy. Um, and there were a few. There were a few of these emperors after Caesar uh, was assassinated, and Augustus took over. There were a couple of emperors who were jerks, who were just not nice people, so to speak. Caligula, for one, that's another one that was crazy, and Nero was absolutely crazy. So three emperors at least that I know of that were pretty crazy. Um, Rome was going through a very strange period of time during the empire. Um, too much power, too much power rested on these emperors, and they were just they were living, and even Rome was living a very strange existence. The gladiators and the killing of animals on the Coliseum, and their thirst for blood was pretty much over the top. It was pretty incredible. The world was nuts back in those days. Anyway, the world was pretty crazy. Constant wars, constant pillage, constant invasion of other nations and countries and areas. There was Today we got the United Nations that tries to keep peace. We have the atomic bombs, and that in itself is a peacekeeper. And the reason why that is a peacekeeper is because everybody is afraid of an atomic war. We don't want an atomic war because millions, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people would die. But back in those days, I guess there was no skin off their backs to go and invade a country because what could happen? A few people get killed. That's about it. Um, and Rome did, and everybody else did. You know, from from the Greek Empire all the way straight through to the Ottoman Empire, it was pretty messy. It was a it was a messy world. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about Caesar, Julius Caesar. And if you ever want to read something kind of fun about Julius Caesar, I would recommend you read Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. Not accurate, not an accurate depiction of what happened. A lot of made up parts. Shakespeare made up a lot of parts. A lot of the speeches were not exactly the way the speeches happened. Um, you know, there was no such thing as someone coming up to Caesar and saying, "Beware of the Ides of March." Uh, that's something that Shakespeare made up, and then a whole bunch of other things. But it does give you a basic idea of what happened, of why the Senate assassinated Caesar, and the civil war that ensued right after this. And if you recall from last class, I told you that uh, there was just too much jealousy. Uh, there weren't any laws laid out. There wasn't a constitution like most countries have today, where the progression of a country, the succession of a country, how a leader succeeds his or her predecessor, how a president becomes a president, how a prime minister, how someone becomes a prime minister, and things like that, didn't exist. So a lot of times they would make agreements between one another, and the Senate would say, okay, go ahead and do that. Do it that way for now. Let's see what happens. So there were no set ways, no set rules or laws governing, right? This is what's called governance, how you govern a country. They didn't have it. And then jealousy would set in, and people wanted what one guy wanted what the other guy had, and they had power. They had power because these guys had armies. Pompey had an army. Uh, Caesar had an army. I mean, they all had armies, and because their job was to go and look for areas that they could invade and take back slaves to Rome. Um, even Crassus had an army, um, and these guys were going out. Pompey was going into Spain to raid and to pillage and that type of stuff, and to battle enemies of Rome. And Caesar would go somewhere else. He was going into Egypt and Africa and that type of stuff. And Crassus was going somewhere else. And so when you give a politician an army that he or she can use at will, um, they're going to try to enlarge their power. They're going to try to take more. And this is what was going on. And Caesar was no different. So let me read on a little bit. Now, before we get started, we've gone through a lot in this course. We've covered a lot of area. Like I told you, we're not going to, there's some areas of history in as far as Rome is concerned, that we're not going to cover in detail because, the history of Rome is so huge, 1,000+ years, 1,700 years or some kind of crazy stuff like that. It's impossible to cover it in the short period of time that we have. So what I wanted to do was to cover the highlights and to give you a sense of what Rome was all about. And what I would hope you do is that after you get these PowerPoints, that you read through them, and so that you can read about the little details that we unfortunately cannot cover in class. But like I told you, I mean, there are people out there that have got PhDs in Roman history. So, and they've written books about it. And, this is a big, big history, very important history in the world. So, it's impossible to cover it in 5 hours of classes. It's just impossible. It would probably take us 5 years. But I can give you a little sense of what went on during that time. Now, based on everything that we've covered, are there any questions whatsoever? Does anybody have a question, a comment, a complaint? I mean, I don't care, whatever. Speak up. I like it when classes are interactive, meaning that the students get involved and ask questions and make comments and that type of stuff. So please do not be afraid to speak up during this class, because actually that's kind of the way I like it. It's kind of the way I like it. So if you don't have any questions, then I'll continue with the lecture. Anyway, Caesar. 2 of the 3 had valid reasons to unite. Pompey wanted his veterans to be rewarded for their bravery in the East, while Crassus hoped to gain not only dignity in a military command, but also sought to recoup money he and his fellow investors had lost during the food crisis in the East. The third member of the gang, Julius Caesar, a military hero in his own right, returned from Spain in triumph, something that he hoped would help bring him additional fame and wealth. While he was not as prosperous as the others, he was actually deeply in debt. Actually, he was. He owed a lot of money to a lot of different people. He too had a goal to be named consul and afterwards gain a consulship, a pro-consulship military command in Gaul. So he wanted more. But amazingly, he was incredibly popular in especially after he came back from Spain. He was incredibly popular in Rome. So now the 3 of these characters, they joined forces. They each had a lot of power individually, but they decided to join forces and bring some order to Rome, to the political atmosphere that Rome was going through. However, to achieve these lofty goals, all 3 realized that mutual support was essential. So by pooling their personal resources, mostly Crassus's money, contacts, Cicero, and most of all ambition, they set their plan in motion. The first order of business, Caesar was able to reconcile the differences between Pompey and Crassus. Next, he married his daughter Julia to Pompey. I feel sorry for Julia. Julia, if I remember my history and the things that I've read, Julia was a young woman. She was not an old woman. I think she might have been like 20 or 21. And Pompey was an old fat guy. But Julia did her duty, married Pompey as a way of sealing the alliance that Caesar had sought with not just Pompey, but also with Crassus. Together, the gang overcame their first obstacle when Caesar was named co-consul for the year of 59 BCE. In other words, 59 before current era, with Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, unfortunately a good friend of Cato. In his The 12 Caesars, Roman historian Suetonius wrote that Caesar succeeded in conciliating Pompey and Marcus Crassus. They were still at odds after their failure to agree on matters of policy while sharing the consulship. Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus now formed a triple pact, kind of like a triumvirate, swearing to oppose all legislation of which any one of them might disapprove. So they tried to make a pact, a short-lived pact, I might add. Despite his best efforts, Caesar was unable to push Pompey's agenda or any of his other reforms through the Senate. By law, a council had the right to veto a proposal made by his fellow council. And that was exactly what Bibulus did. So instead of fighting with the Senate, Caesar took his idea to the popular assembly, right? They had a Senate and an assembly. As Caesar stood in the forum and presented his proposal to the assembly, Bibulus attempted to interfere, but instead was thrown down the steps of the temple of Castor, where he was showered with garbage. He returned to his home, where he remained out of public life. Caesar would rule as co-consul actually, alone. Oh, actually as consul alone. Cato finally admitted defeat and accepted the bill. The veterans got their land. The triumvirate was apparently working. But Crassus died. After the end of his consulship, Caesar and his army crossed over the Alps into Gaul. Remember what I told you? Gaul is up there. It's north of Italy. It's north. It's kind of like, Hungary, Germany, that area, French areas. Pompey, already feeling a tinge of jealousy over Caesar's success, won favor with the Senate when he was given command over the city's grain supply in 57 BCE, after a series of food riots. Next, Pompey and Crassus returned to a joint consulship in 55 BCE. Afterwards, Pompey was named governor of Spain, although he remained in Rome and ruled Spain through a series of deputies. In other words, sending people over with messages and people that were his people running Spain, which was back then called Spania, instead of him being there personally. He really, my understanding is that he did not want to be out of Rome. Had he gone to Spain, he would have been out of the loop of what was happening in Rome. You got to realize that they didn't have any email back then, They didn't have any cellular phones. And information moved very slowly. By the time he would get news of what was going on, had he gone to Spain, by the time he would have got news of what was going on in Rome, would have been a couple of months. Elsewhere, Crassus got his wish and was awarded the command of an army, hoping to achieve personal fame in the East. Unfortunately, he would never realize his goal. In 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae, he was defeated and killed. He was decapitated by the longtime enemy of Rome, the Parthians. In a further insult, his head would be used as a prop by the king in a presentation of the Euripides play, the Bacchae. His death spelled the doom of the triumvirate. Although the alliance had been renewed in 56 BCE, at Lucca, Caesar had even left Gaul to attend, Crassus had been the glue that held them together. He was the more peaceful of the three. Crassus had a lot of money. He was a very wealthy guy. Pompey had power, but no money. Caesar had power, no money for sure. He owed a lot of money and he wanted more power. Both of these guys wanted more power. Um, Crassus, on the other hand, didn't necessarily wanted power. He wanted fame. He wanted to be respected. He had money. He had no need for money. He was very rich. And he managed, in a way, he managed to keep Pompey and Caesar from going at each other. He sort of appeased that relationship. Now that he's gone, now that he got his head handed to him, literally, um, he wasn't there to appease these two titans, these two giants, these two political and military giants that were running Rome and who wanted more power, more money, more fame, more respect than they probably deserved and than what they actually had. Um, Civil War, Caesar is dictator. With 40,000 soldiers, Caesar crossed the Rubicon and returned to Rome. Um, he was wealthier and more powerful, desiring a return to politics and the consulship. By the time he was coming back, he'd raided a lot of areas and he stole a lot of money. The latter was something both Pompey and the conservatives opposed. They didn't want him. They knew that he wanted to be a dictator. By now, Pompey was the favored son of the Senate. And this is where the whole debacle happened. The Senate liked Pompey. Um, the people liked Caesar. And they liked Caesar because Caesar was gutsy. And Caesar had a lot more military wins and victories than Pompey did. He had even been named consul in 52 BCE with the full support of Cato. Later, he was rewarded with the command of the Roman forces in Italy. The deep hatred that had lay dormant for years between Caesar and Pompey, together with Pompey's jealousy, led to a civil war. So these two, they were destined to go at each other. Uh, Crossing the Rubicon has become a popular idiomatic expression. It means crossing a point of no return. And what happened was Caesar stood right here um, with his troops, with his 40,000 troops. He stood right here on this side of the river uh, and said to the troops, we're going to cross the Rubicon and we're going to go into Rome, which we're going to have a lot of problems when we do that. That is going to perhaps uh, lead to a civil war. He told that to his troops. And, the troops said, oh, go ahead and cross the Rubicon. We're with you. We don't care what happens. We understand that crossing the Rubicon is a symbolic gesture that once we cross the Rubicon, there's no turning back. So today, you might read something that uses that idiomatic expression that says, so and so, what so and so did was equivalent to crossing the Rubicon or something like that. They'll mention Rubicon, and when you hear Rubicon, you will know that what they mean is the point of no return. Once you cross this line, you can't go back. You've got to fight forward and you got to take your lumps and whatever happens to you is going to happen, because crossing the Rubicon was a symbolic gesture on the part of Caesar. On the part of Caesar. Um, because of his friendship with both men, Cicero grew concerned over the hostility between Caesar and Pompey. Cicero was friends with both of these guys. He wrote to Caesar in March of 49 BC, if you are disposed to protect our friend Pompey and reconcile him to yourself and the state, you will certainly find no one better adapted to that aim than myself. So he's offering his services and his help to make sure that these two, Pompey and Caesar, became friends and struck some kind of a deal. I have always advocated peace. Now I am deeply concerned for the rightful position of Pompey. He recognized that Pompey had the ear of the Senate, and therefore he was a powerful figure. Uh, and he did not want Pompey to just disappear, to go away, to die, uh, to lose power. Uh, he knew that that balance of power needed to be there in order for the governance of Rome to continue um, in a good way, to continue and not have, he wanted to avoid civil war. Cicero further added that he still considered both men as his friends and hoped to achieve a reconciliation between yourself and Pompey, as he said, and peace for the people of Rome. Caesar wrote back that he trusted Cicero would not interfere, which is very politically astute, right? Smart. Said, hey, Cicero, don't get involved in this. This is an argument between me and Pompey. You have nothing to do with this. Although I was convinced that you would take no rash or ill-judged action in the name of our friendship, that you should not make any move now that things have gone my way. Pompey left Rome with his army for Greece and was followed by Caesar in 48 BCE. They met in the Battle of Farsalis. Caesar was victorious. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach on the orders of Ptolemy the 13th and beheaded. Okay, so I gotta tell you a little bit about this, and I don't know whether any of you took my Greek class, uh, but Ptolemy was. Let me see. Let me write it down so that you understand what's going on here. Um, Egypt um, became a Greek republic. They became a Greek possession uh, with uh, what's his name? Uh, the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. The name had escaped me. So Alexander the Great went into Rome, into Egypt, and took over Egypt around 300 uh, BCE, right? Uh, 300 years before Christ. And he did not want to govern Egypt. He wanted to continue invading countries, other nations, other countries, other areas, and gaining more territory. He was Greek, but he was Macedonian, right? He wasn't really from like Athens or something like that. but he was Greek. He wanted to continue with his fights all over the place. So he appointed his general that had helped him take over Egypt. His name was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy took on about 3 or 4 wives. Ptolemy became the Pharaoh. If you recall, the Pharaoh means the king of Egypt. He became the Pharaoh. He took on a bunch of wives, and these wives had a bunch of kids. I mean, a bunch of kids. And back in those days, amazingly enough, and I happen to be writing an article about this because I write for history and I write for biography, which is another magazine. They had a habit, a really bad habit, of half brothers and half sisters marrying. In fact, Cleopatra was the daughter of a brother and a sister, half brother and half sister, right? And they did this because they wanted to keep the line of pharaohs within their family. They didn't want to go outside of the family. They didn't really realize the problems with DNA and genetics that can come up when people intermarry inside of a family. They didn't realize this. But the thing is that they were, after Ptolemy died, his sons and daughters became pharaohs and, kings and queens all the way for 13 generations, or about 300 years. So Ptolemy the 13th was Cleopatra's brother, And he was a power-hungry and nasty young man who, by the way, before Cleopatra had her child with Caesar, which she did, and then had 3 children with Mark Antony, which she did, she had married him. She had married him as part of the family tradition, but the marriage didn't work. But nonetheless, Ptolemy, as a way of consolidating power and ingratiating himself with Caesar, he had actually put his bet on Caesar. He was betting that Caesar would have power, assassinated Pompey. He assassinated Pompey. As it turned out, just so that you see how crazy these times were, as it turned out, Cleopatra wanted to be the pharaoh. She wanted to be the queen. And she had Mark Antony assassinate him and the other brother. There were 2 Ptolemies, 2 Ptolemy brothers. And she had Mark Antony assassinate both of these guys so that she could become queen. This was the craziness, the insanity of those days. Now, you're going to say, geez, brothers and sisters getting married, isn't that a problem? Can that be a problem? And yes, it can. That is a big, big problem. But they didn't know it. In fact, Tutankhamun, the pharaoh Tutankhamun, was deformed. He was deformed because he was the product of brothers and sisters marrying for like 2 or 3 generations. And I can show you pictures if you want to look. When they reconstructed his skeleton recently, they found that he had a deformed leg and a deformed hip, and that he was literally a deformed man. And that deformity came through um, the intermarriage. Now, amazingly, Cleopatra was never deformed, but when she tried to have children with Ptolemy, she couldn't. Uh, the DNA, the genetics would not allow it. When she hooked up with Caesar, she immediately had one child. And when Caesar died and she hooked up with Mark Antony, she had 3 kids. But she could not have children with her half brother. I guess genetics can only go so far. But anyway, that's kind of the story, just so that you, and why am I telling you the story? Because it's actually kind of interesting, number one. And number two, so that you can get an idea of how messed up the people of these countries were, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. They were crazy. These people were insane. They were just totally insane. Anyway, so Ptolemy the 13th, right? The great, 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 great grandson of Ptolemy, the general whom Alexander the Great assigned as Pharaoh. In fact, he was the first non-Egyptian Pharaoh ever, right? And that's why Cleopatra was not Egyptian, even though she had been, of course, born in Egypt. But she was different. She didn't look Egyptian. She wasn't really Egyptian ethnically. Her ethnicity was not Egyptian, was something else. But it was insane. This is insane. But anyway, his head was then presented to Caesar. Caesars would go on to secure his power in both Asia Minor and Northern Africa, eventually returning to Rome, where he served as his new role as dictator, only to die by assassination on the Ides of March on 44 before Christ, BCE, before Common Era. So that's kind of the story about Caesar. Kind of an interesting story. And again, and remember, I told you there are some events that I want you to remember. Going back to the kings, right? To the 7 kings and the Punic Wars, and Hannibal and his elephants and all that stuff. Caesar is one that you should remember, that you should know about and remember, because Caesar was a watershed moment. With the death of Caesar and Mark Antony defeating Brutus in the civil war that ensued after Caesar, that's when Rome turned from being a republic to being an empire, to being a dictatorship. And after that, all of these crazy emperors came out. The Commoduses of the world, the Neros, right? The Caligulas. That would have never happened had the Senate had a powerful hand in the governance of Rome. It would have never happened. After Augustus became emperor, the Senate was neutered in a way. Their power diminished substantially. And the emperor was the one that really called the shots. And that's the reason why the Senate killed Caesar. They assassinated Caesar because they knew that Caesar wanted to be a dictator. He wanted to turn the country into an empire rather than a republic. And Brutus, who was very much on the side of the Senate, agreed to lead an assassination squad and kill Caesar. This is just a picture of the Battle of Farsalis, the initial troop position, and all that kind of stuff. Caesar was a great tactician. He was a great military tactician. He knew how to win battles. He just knew how to win battles. Caesar's assassination caused political and social turmoil in Rome. Without the dictator's leadership, the city was ruled by his friend and colleague, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, in other words. Soon afterward, Octavius, whom Caesar adopted through his will, arrived in Rome. Octavius became Augustus. He changed his name to Augustus. Historians regard Octavius as Octavian due to the Roman naming conventions. Tried to align himself with the Caesarian faction. In 43 BC, along with Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Caesar's best friend, he legally established the Second Triumvirate. This alliance would last for 5 years. Upon the formation, 130 to 300 senators were executed, and their property was confiscated due to their supposed support for the the liberators. So as you can see, that moment in which Augustus, Gaius Octavius, right, came into power, that was it. That was the end. The first thing these guys did was grab the senators, whom they knew had wanted Caesar dead, number one. Number two, they wanted to take away power from the Senate. And what better way to take power from the Senate than to execute them? Chop their heads off, hang them on a cross, or whatever they did back in those days. So there you go. Roman Republic flushed down the toilet. Flushed down the toilet. In 42 BC, the Senate deified Caesar, whatever senators were left, as Divus Iulius. Octavian thus became Divi Filius, right? Octavian Augustus, the same thing. Divi Filius. Filius means filial, meaning friendly, brotherly, friendly sort of a deal. The son of the deified, or Filius, there you go, the son of the deified. In the same year, Octavian and Antony defeated both Caesar's assassins and the leaders of the liberators, Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus committed suicide, and so did Gaius Cassius, Longinus. In the Battle of Philippi, very famous battle, the Second Triumvirate was marked by the proscriptions of many senators and equities. After a revolt led by Antony's brother, Lucius Antonius, more than 300 senators were executed. And the anniversary of the Ides of March, on the anniversary of the Ides of March. So exactly a year after Caesar was assassinated. Lucius was spared. Well, big deal. They killed 300 senators. The triumvirate proscribed several important men, including Cicero, whom Antony hated, Quintus Tullius Cicero, the younger brother of the orator, and Lucius Julius Caesar, cousin and friend of the acclaimed general, for his support of Cicero. However, Lucius was pardoned, perhaps because his sister Julia had intervened for him. The triumvirate divided the empire among the triumvirs. Lepidus was given charge of Africa, Antony the eastern provinces, and Octavian remained in Italia and controlled Hispania and Gaul. The second triumvirate expired in 38 BC, but was renewed for 5 more years. However, the relationship between Octavian and Antony had deteriorated, as it always did. Here were 2 guys that were running the triumvirate, but they still couldn't get along, which is, typical of these jerks. And Lepidus was forced to retire in 36 BC after betraying Octavian in Sicily. By the end of the triumvirate, Antony was living in Ptolemaic Egypt, meaning, the Egypt that was run by the descendants of Ptolemy, the general of Alexander the Great. An independent and rich kingdom ruled by Antony's lover, Cleopatra. By then, Antony had helped Cleopatra get rid of her brother, and she had become Cleopatra the 7th, because there had been 7 other Cleopatras before her. She wasn't the only Cleopatra, but we know her as Cleopatra. Nobody calls her Cleopatra the 7th. We just know her as Cleopatra, because the other Cleopatras were really, they weren't as colorful as she was. Antony's affair with Cleopatra was seen as an act of treason, since she was queen of another country. Additionally, Antony adopted a lifestyle considered too extravagant and Hellenistic for a Roman. Hellenistic meaning Greek. Kind of a Greek loosey-goosey kind of an existence or a behavior. Following Antony's donation of Alexandria, which gave to Cleopatra the title of Queen of Kings, and to Antony's and Cleopatra's children the regal titles to the newly conquered eastern territories, war between Octavian and Antony broke out. So now, Mark Antony marries or hooks up with Cleopatra, has kids with her. He begins to become less Roman in his attitude. Corruption. He begins to, look for ways of making money illegally and all this kind of stuff. He starts giving properties to his children, and that was going to be cause for war. That was going to be cause for a civil war. Octavian annihilated Egyptian forces in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide, as we all know. Now Egypt was conquered by the Roman Empire, and for the Romans, a new era had begun. So this was truly a watershed moment for Egypt. Truly a watershed moment for Egypt. Many things happened within 10, 20 years. I don't mean Egypt, I mean Rome. Within 20 years or so, Rome had gone from being a functional, somewhat functional society and government, with a Senate that at least handled part of the government, and with councils who were not emperors, they were not dictators, and they could only stay in their position for a certain period of time, to an empire with an emperor, a dictator. Um, but everybody saw it coming. Most historians said that this was uh, an evolutionary process that was quite inevitable. It was going to happen. It was going to happen. So anyway, so now begins the Roman Empire. Does anybody have any questions? Any comments? Any comments whatsoever? Is it shocking that Cleopatra was married to her brother? Is it shocking that so many of these pharaohs married, sisters, half sisters? They weren't full sisters, they were half sisters, but nonetheless married within the family. Is it shocking that these people could not get along no matter what? Is it shocking of the brutality, the insanity? Is it? What do you guys say? What do you guys say? Eric, what do you say, Eric? Eric Gong. Enlighten us with your thoughts, Eric. What about Justin? Justin Huo. Tell us, what do you think, Justin?
I think it's really shocking because in the present day, people would never do
I
that.
can't hear you. Justin, you're staying quiet. All right, we'll go to someone else. Lucas Lee. What do you say, Lucas?
I think it's
What do
really
you think about this whole mess?
I think that's very interesting that they can never get along, but we can get along very easily.
I can't hear you either. Do you have your thingy turned off?
Can you hear me?
Anyway, does anybody want to comment? Maybe Sophia. Sophia comments. I know Sophia. She's a smart kid. She's got opinions. What do you say, Sophia?
Basically, I think.
I don't know why I can't hear you guys. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Because I can't hear you.
Yes.
Well, whatever. Anyway, so the empire, the principate, in 27 BC, and at the age of 36, Octavian was the sole Roman leader. In that year, he took the name Augustus. Like I told you, he became Augustus because he wanted to follow Julius, right? It's June, July, August. He wanted to follow Julius. That event is usually taken by historians as the beginning of the Roman Empire. Although Rome was an imperial state since 146 BC, when Carthage was razed by Scipio and Greece was conquered by Lucius Mummius, officially the government was a republic. But Augustus assumed absolute power. His reform of the government brought about a 2-century period, colloquially referred to by Romans as the Pax Romana. Pax means peace. Peace. The Roman peace. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was established by Augustus. The emperors of this dynasty were Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Those were the guys. And out of this group of idiots, Caligula and Nero were the craziest. They were the two craziest. Nero burnt down Rome, and Caligula was known for having big parties and doing all kinds of crazy junk. The dynasty is so called due to the gens Julia, family of Augustus, and the gens Claudia, family of Tiberius. The Julio Claudian started the destruction of republican values. But on the other hand, they boosted Rome's status as the central power of the world. So they stopped being democratic. And that's, whatever little democracy they had, whatever little joint decision making they had, just totally disappeared. While Caligula and Nero are usually remembered as dysfunctional emperors in popular culture, Augustus and Claudius are remembered as emperors who were successful in politics and the military. The dynasty instituted imperial tradition in Rome and frustrated any attempt to reestablish a republic. Then came the Flavian dynasty. After those guys came the Flavian dynasty. The Flavians were the second dynasty to rule Rome. By 68 AD, already into after Christ, year of Nero's death, there was no chance of return to the old and traditional Roman Republic. Thus, a new emperor had to rise. After the turmoil in the year of the four emperors, Titus Flavius, Vespasianus, anglicized as Vespasian, took control of the empire and established a new dynasty. Under the Flavians, Rome continued its expansion, and the state remained secure. The most significant military campaign undertaken during the Flavian period was the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 current era CE by Titus. The destruction of the city was the culmination of the Roman campaign in Judea following the Jewish uprising of 66. The Second Temple was demolished, after which Titus soldiers proclaimed him Imperator in honor of the victory. Jerusalem was sacked and much of the population killed or dispersed. Josephus claims, Josephus was a very famous historian, claims that 1.1 million people were killed during the siege. Imagine that. How many people died, of which a majority were Jewish. 97,000 were captured and enslaved, including Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala. Many fled to areas around the Mediterranean, thus reportedly refused to accept a wreath of victory, as there is no merit in the vanquishing peoples forsaken by their own God. Vespasian was a general under Claudius and Nero. He fought as a commander in the First Jewish-Roman War, along with his son Titus, following the turmoil of the year of the four emperors in 69 AD. Four emperors were enthroned: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and lastly Vespasian, who crushed Vitellius' forces and became emperor. He reconstructed many buildings which were uncompleted, like a statue of Apollo and the temple of Divus Claudius, the deified Claudius, both initiated by Nero. Buildings once destroyed by the Great Fire of Rome were rebuilt, and he revitalized the capital. Vespasian also started the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, more commonly known as the Coliseum. The historians Josephus and Pliny the Elder wrote their works during Vespasian's reign. Vespasian was Josephus's sponsor, and Pliny dedicated his naturalist Historia to Titus, son of Vespasian. Vespasian sent legions to defend the eastern frontier. In Cappadocia, extended the occupation of Britannia, which is modern day England, Wales, and southern Scotland, and reformed the tax system. He died in 79 AD. All right, so let's skip over some of these guys because, again, as I say, there are other things that I want to cover. So I'm just going to flick through these PowerPoint slides, point out what was going on, but I don't want to go into detail with each and every one of these guys, even though many of these emperors were important characters in the history of Rome. And they were important because, Rome was consolidating its status as an empire, consolidating military victories outside of Rome. Romans were becoming richer. Politicians were becoming richer. And the Romans really, I've never read anywhere that the Romans really objected to the emperors. They didn't object to the emperors being dictators. They were getting what they liked, which was they were able to go to the Coliseum and see people slash each other. They were able to see lions get butchered. They were able to see all of that stuff. And for the most part, they were happy. They were happy. It wasn't like a government that prohibits people from speaking out. The idea of freedom of speech and things like that really weren't an issue for these people. You could probably say something about any of these emperors, negative about these emperors, and you wouldn't get in trouble. They would just consider you to be a nut. Because for the most part, people in Rome were fairly happy. Then came the Nerva Antonin dynasty. One particular character within this dynasty is worthwhile you remembering, and that is Commodus. This jerk down here, this idiot down here. And Commodus was like Nero, like Caligula, was a nut. And he was just another one of these guys. The Nerva Antonin dynasty from 96 AD to 192 AD was the rule of emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Lucius, and Commodus. Now, Commodus, this guy, was actually the son of Marcus Aurelius, which is this idiot over here, this jerk. So this guy was his son. During their rule, Rome reached its territorial and economical apogee, meaning its highest point. This was a time of peace for Rome. The criteria for choosing an emperor were the qualities of the candidate and no longer ties of kinship. Additionally, there were no civil wars or military defeats in this period. Following Domitian's murder, the Senate rapidly appointed Nerva to hold imperial dignity. This was the first time that senators chose the emperor since Octavian was honored by the titles of Princeps of Augustus and Augustus. Nerva had a noble ancestry, and he had served as an advisor to Nero and the Flavians. His rule restored many of the liberties once assumed by Domitian and started the last golden era of Rome. So while there were some nutty guys, these other six emperors, as I say, make the people fairly happy. The average Roman was happy. They were making money. There were no wars. For some reason, Rome had managed to squelch any of all of their enemies all around. And Rome had become the kingpin right smack in the middle of Europe. They had become the nation with total hegemony, with total control over a very large territory. Trajan, Nerva died in 98 AD, and his successor and heir was the general Trajan. I'm going to skip over this. I want to get to Commodus because that's the guy that I want you to remember. By the way, the five good emperors, the ancient Roman imperial succession of Nerva. So the Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius, Marcus Aurelius, the father of Commodus, who presided over the most majestic days of the Roman Empire. They were considered to be the five good emperors, the five good emperors. Of course, then came this idiot. From Hadrian to Commodus, many Romans immigrated to Hispania, which is modern day Spain and Portugal, and stayed for generations, in some cases intermarrying with Iberians. Iberians are people from the Iberian Peninsula. In other words, people from Portugal and Spain. One of these families produced the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian withdrew all the troops stationed in Parthia, Armenia, and Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, abandoning Trajan's conquest. Hadrian's army crushed the revolt in Mauritania and Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea. This was the last large-scale Jewish revolt against the Romans and was suppressed with massive repercussions in Judea. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Hadrian remained the province of Judea, Provincia Syria Palestina, after one of Judea's most hated enemies. And let me see what this is. They built a big wall actually in England, in what is now Scotland. If you're ever traveling through that area, this wall is huge. He constructed fortifications and walls like the celebrated Hadrian's Wall, which separated Roman Britannia and the tribes of modern-day Scotland. Following Hadrian's death in 138 AD, his successor Antonius Pius built temples. I don't want to get into too much of that. Marcus Aurelius, who was the father of Commodus, came in. His co-emperor was Lucius Verus, died in 169 AD, probably victim of the Antonin plague, a pandemic that killed nearly 5 million people through the empire in 165 to 180 AD. This was one of those plagues that hit Europe. And in fact, it's the plague that brought down Commodus, his son, because they blamed it on him. the people of Rome blamed on Commodus's craziness for the plague. And they said, you could have done things to avoid the plague. You could have taken measures to isolate people and do things like that. But instead, he was more interested in fighting as a gladiator because he liked to fight as a gladiator, but he cheated because he would drug his, his opponents or bleed them, cut their veins so that they would bleed out or be, low on blood when they came into the Coliseum, and then Commodus would kill them. So a lot of crazy people. Nerva, this is Nerva Aurelius. I don't want to get into this guy, but he was one of these five good guys in Severan Dynasty. Oops, this is not you guys. This is let me get rid of this. This was the last class that I taught this. So anyway, so let's keep on going. This is another. Okay, so now, just around this time, people are sending messages. People are sending messages. Well, nobody's saying anything important. Okay, so now, somewhere around this time, Christianity begins to take over. And this is where we're going to leave it, because we're going to finish the last chapter of this by talking about Christianity, briefly talking about Christianity, because I want to touch on, so let me put a little note here. This is the fourth class. I want to talk a little bit about Christianity, but what I really want to get into is things Rome that are really interesting. I'm sure that you're more interested in this than some of the little details about who did this and who did that. I want to talk about the architecture of Rome, which is really amazing. I want to talk about the roads of Rome. I want to talk about the aqueduct, which is the way of moving water around. There's a lot of things about Rome that I kind of want to talk to you about. The Coliseum, how things are made, all the architectural inventions that the Romans did, and we'll close the class next week. Questions from anybody? Anything he wants to say about commissariat? This is a hard to understand. I try to make the